Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder to support the transmission. The best way to do that, of course, is becoming a paid subscriber on the Geopolitics and Empire Substack, $5 a month or more, $50 or more a year. I may soon be increasing the paid membership fee and some of the things you get for that. We do private weekly chats where we discuss current events with paid subscribers only. The next one, I think, is in a day or two. I do a weekly write-up of the week's news and some commentary. And then on occasion, we have members-only chats with past podcast guests. You can also buy me a coffee, send money through Wise, Donor Box, that sort of stuff. Purchase a consultation if you want to just chat with me. And I do have to give a shout-out to this month's sponsor, Mikkel Thorup and the Expat Money Summit. That's the world's largest offshore event. It's going to take place online entirely from October 7th to the 11th. And Mikkel, he's the host of the Expat Money Show, a highly sought after expat consultant with over 2 decades of experience. He's been on my TNT radio show. I've been on his Expat Money show. And, you know, I'm not saying this just to say it, but every year I do watch his free online summit. A lot of his headline speakers most of them have been guests of Geopolitics and Empire. They include Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Tom Woods, and Mark Faber, Tom Luongo. And at the summit, again, it's free. You can watch it online for free. And they'll be talking about crafting your perfect plan B, getting a second passport. I've got 3. They'll also be talking about diversifying your finances offshore, investing in international real estate, like our guest coming up, and getting in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. You can get your free ticket. You need to register. You go over to expatmoneysummit.com. The link is in the description. And I'll also be participating in one of the panels discussing World War III with the guys from Anti-War and Libertarian Institute, Dave DeCamp and Kyle Anzalone. Returning to the Rebel transmission here is Riley Waggaman, who's manning his end-of-the-world outpost somewhere in Siberia or on the outskirts of Moscow, from which he writes his dispatches at edwardslavsquat.substack.com. Dobro požalovat obratno, tavarish Waggaman.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's great to catch up again, and I hope everything's going well. I'm in Novgorod Oblast, which is a little north of Moscow, between Moscow and St. Petersburg, and thankfully no snow yet, but it's, just a matter of time. But I hope everything's going well for you over in sunny Mexico.
Yeah, just reading the papers yesterday, the Mexican government is assisting cartels at the here in Jalisco, where I am, and in between Michoacan and Jalisco. The Jalisco State Police are helping the cartels. It's not a joke. This is mainstream news here in Mexico. Drone bomb us citizens and steal their livestock, take over their homes, and basically rape, rob, pillage, and steal. So that's how things are in Mexico. What are you going to do? And some of my listeners have been asking to get you on. I follow your Substack and your work, and some folks were asking about your organic farm or your outpost or your institute. How is it going? What is going on there? Or as Tom Waits would say, what's he building in there? Just could you tell us a bit about where you're at?
Yeah, so basically, shortly after I started blogging under the Slavsquat moniker, I was contacted by an individual who was living in St. Petersburg, and she said, obviously things are going south. We should try to find some like-minded individuals and scoop up some property somewhere in Russia and get out of the cities. And that sounded pretty cool to me. And so this woman, who is known under the pseudonym of Katerina on my blog, she's not actually Russian, but she's lived in Russia for 20 years. And she found this little village in Novgorod Oblast, which was a former collective farm during the Soviet Union, which basically is now semi-abandoned. But it's a beautiful place. We have access walking distance to a river and 2 lakes. Beautiful nature. It can get pretty chilly during the winter, and I have to say that May and June there was in painful amount of mosquitoes, and then the flies came after them. It was horrible, but that's over. We got past that. And anyway, we bought up some property. Actually, we now, through this little group that we have, we own I guess 3 properties, something like that, in this village. And we have cows, we have goats, we have chickens, um, we have several dogs, cats, and just trying to make it work, just trying to become more self-sufficient, get back to the basics. And it's been a there's a very steep learning curve to this kind of stuff, I'd have to say, but you just have to make it work. And so it's definitely been an education. In fact, it's one of these situations where you think you know stuff about how to survive and how to live, and then you realize you know absolutely nothing. And it's so painful too, because these other, there are still some villagers in the village, and these guys like can do everything. Your washing machine breaks, and like, oh yeah, you just gotta like, it's the disc thing inside the vat. Like, oh yeah, of course. Or something like, they can do everything, like like electrical. They know how pipes work. They can milk a cow. They like build their own banyas. And here I'm just a useless blogger from America. So, but I'm here to learn, and I'm here to try to uh, you know, put myself in a situation where I feel like I want my own sustainability, right? I've got my own sustainable development plan. And so that's what I'm going for. And it's been an adventure. There's been good days, there's been bad days. But yeah, and we've had some guests up here. Actually, we had some very talented musicians from St. Petersburg who came maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they played some traditional folk music on their balalaikas, and we were dancing and singing, and other members of the village came and hung out with us, and it was a great time. It was very uplifting experience. And going forward, we really hope that we will attract like-minded Russians, or maybe people who are non-Russian but live in Russia, and we can get something going. Milk each other's cows, eat each other's eggs, and just hang out.
There you go. For listeners who are interested in expatriating to Russia, there's one option. I know Tim Kirby, who's been on the podcast, he's got another, or people can just go way out to the far east of Russia, and they'll get a free plot of land, and they can work their way towards citizenship. And you're more advanced than I am, and so I think you should be sort of proud. I'm just like you. I don't know how to do much of that stuff, but at some point you got to start on that road. And so it's nice you've created your own 15-minute city to escape from the 15-minute city, and that's the stuff you've been writing about. So at least in your sustainable SDG sustainable 15-minute city, there's not going to be PCR tests or biometrics, and so you'll be safe from that at the very least. I don't know though if you're outside of the zone of potential nuclear strikes from NATO and the West, but we will. I guess you'll find out, and maybe get your thoughts on the state of the not war in Ukraine. I haven't seen too much information. I haven't been following it as closely. Kind of seems like it's just it's at a point where it's like a war of attrition. It's just trudging along, but we do see from east and west, escalation, nuclear talk of the use of nuclear weapons, modernizations, B-52 bombers. The Chinese and the Russians were skirting on, I think, around the west coast of the U.S. recently, and then they do the same to Russia. Are you following this closely? What's the chatter in Russia about the war in Ukraine, as well as the potential for Third World War?
Yeah, well, the not war, the way that I approach it, really, I'm not one of these guys who watches the daily YouTube map updates where, depending on who you're listening to, right? It's either, the Ukrainian armed forces are slaughtering the Moscow hordes, or the Russian military is punishing the nationalist fascist Nazis in Ukraine every day very severely and killing 10 people for every person who's wounded or whatever. And but for me, I'm just outcome focused, right? So the way that I view this war and the way that I encourage others to think about this conflict, which I hope no matter where you stand on it, I hope you understand how tragic and horrific it really is what were the stated goals? What was the Russian government, or you might even say Putin's stated goals, because he's the guy who sort of announced it. What were the stated goals going in, right, in February of 2022? And, of these goals, have any of them been accomplished or, achieved? Or maybe on the other hand, maybe some of these stated goals are even further from being solved now, right? Maybe the war has made achieving these goals even more difficult than before the SMO started. And basically, if we're outcome focused, we should think about, so where's the off ramp here? Like, eventually the conflict has to end, and what are the most likely scenarios? Post whenever, whether the conflict freezes or there's a decisive victor, possibly. And look, let's just go through the stated goals. We've done a lot, but let's do it again. Putin said the protection of Donbass, right? He said denazification, demilitarization. He stated in his own way, and even in statements, ultimatums issued before the SMO started, that NATO, he considered NATO expansion into Ukraine, and in general, the eastward expansion was considered an existential threat to the Russian Federation, and that, in a more broad statement that Putin actually used in his sort of, SMO declaration, was that Russia could not allow the creation of an anti-Russia in Ukraine on Russia's border, that this would be unacceptable. I don't think I'm missing anything. That's basically the gist of the justifications given before they went in. And so, I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. Ukraine has never been more militarized than it is today. Never. It's never had the kind of high-tech gear, even though, yeah, Ukraine did have a relationship with NATO starting 10 years ago, and NATO was helping to train the Ukrainian military and get it up to NATO standards. We're on a totally different level now, a completely different level. So the militarization thing is not going that great. Denazification, interesting thing about that's the one thing, when Putin did that interview with Tucker Carlson, that's the one thing that he admitted. Tucker Carlson asked that question. He said, all right, you launched this SMO, has it been successful? And Putin said, no, we haven't. It hasn't. The SMO hasn't. We can't declare victory yet because we haven't denazified Ukraine. And then Carlson said, well, what does that mean? That's kind of a vague statement. And Putin gave a very specific answer. He said, it means that there needs to be laws in place in Ukraine to prevent, the spread of Nazism or the promotion of Nazi ideology, something to that effect. So by Putin's own admission, denazification has not taken place, although many people point to, for example, the Azov battalion has been mostly, I guess, liquidated, you could say. At the same time, you had all of their top commanders swapped in a prisoner exchange for Medvedchuk, who is a infamous oligarch and who also is close friends with Putin. So that was quite bizarre. But anyway, according to Putin, denazification has not occurred, using his own definition. I want to talk about NATO expansion. NATO has 2 new members, Sweden and Finland, right? And nothing has stopped NATO from expanding. In fact, this conflict, unfortunately, has galvanized NATO, and I would say even made it more dangerous and more of a threat to Russia. Like, if the SMO was designed to say, hey, we got to stop this. Like, you got to stop with the expansion. You got to sit down. You got to start treating us as an equal. That hasn't happened. We often hear about these red lines, that Moscow has these red lines, and once they're crossed, Putin's going to open up a can of whoop ass. there have been so many red lines that have been stated, and every single time NATO just walks across them, just they don't care, and Moscow does nothing in response. And it's really scary. It's really scary how nothing that has occurred since February 2022 has uh, been perceived by NATO as, oh yeah, we should rethink our policy towards Russia. The exact opposite has happened, which is dangerous for everyone. And then finally, if you want to talk about the protection of the Donbass, the Ukrainian military is still firmly entrenched in a very large portion of Donetsk. It still even controls a sliver of Lugansk. There's really, even if you want to talk about, protecting Donbass, I mean, Donetsk is still shelled on the regular. And not only Donetsk, but now Belgorod, which is in, mainland Russia. You have attacks on Crimea on a regular basis. You have drone strikes that reach pretty far inside Russia, hitting infrastructure and oil refineries. And, like every single day, for example, you have stories in Russian media about like some poor family in Belgorod has their car hit by a drone and, they die along with their children. It's really, really horrible. And this conflict hasn't, like, the protection of Donbass, in my opinion, was the most straightforward objective, right? Because if you really wanted a neutral Ukraine that wasn't in bed with NATO, it doesn't just require a piece of paper, it also requires like some soft power, like showing Ukraine that Russia can be a dependable partner, economic partner, security partner. And that's not so easy just to dictate. You have to put in some, diplomatic muscle, cultural influence, et cetera, et cetera. Taking Donbass, though, or just pushing the Ukrainian military out of Donbass, it's a concrete military objective, which still has not been achieved and it might not actually happen militarily. At this point, I'm leaning towards, if the Ukrainian military leaves the rest of Donetsk and the little bit of Lugansk, it's going to be through negotiations. I don't see them being pushed out militarily at this point, which is really bizarre when you think about Russia is supposed to have the second largest military in the world, the second most powerful military in the world. And it's just been a total disaster. And so many people have died, and I don't know what has actually been achieved, right? And that's the problem here. Like, I think you can make a very, very strong argument, in fact, that the SMO has exacerbated all of the problems that existed before it started in February 2022. If you wanted a neutral Ukraine has never been more anti-Russia. If you wanted to keep NATO out of Ukraine and off of Russia's doorstep, the exact opposite has happened over the last 2 years. If we were supposed to protect Donbass is being turned into a moon crater, and the Ukrainian military isn't going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, I'm sorry, guys, if you're listening to your favorite YouTuber who's been telling you every day for the last 2.5 years that the Ukrainian military is about to be encircled in a giant, cooked alive in a giant cauldron, and you're marching to Odessa and Kharkiv and Kiev. They're lying to you. They're talking total bullshit, and this has to stop. It's so embarrassing. It's so embarrassing. Please stop doing that. Please, I beg you. So that's my public service announcement on that one. But anyway, so that's my overall take. I consider this war to be an absolute tragedy for both the Ukrainians and Russians. I do not see the off-ramp. I don't see how this is going to end well. Like, if you believe in Russia's stated objectives, how does this war achieve those stated objectives? Like, where's the positive outcome? And for Ukraine, it's been also disastrous. I mean, a lot of people have been killed. The government sucks ass. Zelensky is now basically ruling by decree. Like, they canceled elections. They don't even try to have fake elections like they do in Russia. They just canceled them, right? And it's like, you just see the parallels here, and it's just a disaster for Slavs. It's just a Slav calling. And And meanwhile, Gazprom is paying Kiev to transit its delicious Russian gas across Ukraine to the EU, which was supposed to, freeze to death over, during the winter. And the EU is sending weapons back to Ukraine to kill Russians with. Like, what is this? What are we witnessing? So anyway,
yeah. So I've got a whole bunch of questions here. Then one thing that comes to mind, we saw the whole in the 2000s Bush, Cheney, Wolfowitz, neocon crew roll out the global war on terror, the forever war, the pretext for just forever war, terrorism. And one thing that came to my mind was this is almost like the Russian version of the global war on terror. Just they can just launch this forever war in Ukraine, and later on who knows where else. And Rollo Slavsky, aka Rurik Skywalker, who's been a guest on the podcast. He's been a popular guest on Geopolitics and Empire. He's written something lately that was interesting about Serbia, the Yugoslav model, how Milosevic was with the elites initially, and that when Serbia was being attacked by the West, there was this game that was played, and eventually the West took out Milosevic, and that Rurik is arguing that this might happen with Russia. That eventually soon we might see like NATO going for the gold, going big or going home, trying to dismember, destroy Russia and do regime change, with Putin. So thoughts on that, and we're sort of extrapolating here. It's hard. You and I both are like we're trying to figure out what's really going on. Is Russia that incompetent? Do you think, or is in some way, as Yuri Roshka likes to call them, the collective Kremlin, which I think, as you've been detailing, there's definitely globalism in the Russian oligarchy. And so are they that incompetent, or is Russia somehow in on this sort of globalist war? How do you sort of square these circles, where we'll get to that subject in a bit of, they're implementing globalist technocracy, QR codes, vaccine passports, digital face pay, the whole algorithm ghetto. But they're apparently fighting with NATO. I kind of view it as two cartels. Like, you have here in Mexico different cartels. And of course, eventually one cartel, they both have the same ideology. But, one mafia or one cartel eventually wants to destroy the other and take over their territory and have a monopoly. And that's kind of how I view the collective Kremlin and the collective West. Is there's no good guys. They're all just sort of bad guys, two mafias that want, maybe the Russian mafia wants to sort of be left alone, but the Western mafia is like, no, we gotta take him over. How do you thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but basically I feel as if almost all modern conflicts, and probably conflicts going back many centuries, it's all just mostly oligarchic infighting, right? It's rich and powerful people who want what other rich and powerful people have. And they're never the ones who do the fighting. They just send they send the peasants to go get vaporized on their behalf. And I'm saying that it's true. Like, the Ukrainian government is horrible in so many ways. And so it's easy, obviously, for the Kremlin to say, well, Zelensky is a puppet, and Ukraine is corrupt, and blah blah blah, and we're fighting for, and they'll just give this list, they'll just moralize. And Ukraine can do the exact same thing to Russia, and with a lot of good reasons, but at the end of the day, it's not about who's the most moral or who's the most righteous. It has nothing to do with that. If it did, you wouldn't be cooperating, transiting gas across your territory with the people that you allegedly hate and need to denazify, or stop the Russian orc aggression, but you're transiting their gas for them, right? Like, what's so amazing to me is how, people make this argument, Russia ran out of options. It had to act. It had to go into Ukraine, and they'll do this whole song and dance routine. It's like, how can you say that when you're still allowed to cooperate? Oligarchs are still able to cooperate to make money on energy exports. But for some reason, we're not able to find any kind of common understanding, that can save, hundreds of thousands of lives. My position has always been the best solution, the best peace deal that we can come up with is that I think that Ukraine should just be turned into a giant gas pipeline, and everyone just builds their house on top of the pipes, and that way no one will die anymore, right? And we can just build that all the way to Moscow, through Belgorod, through Crimea, and no one will be hurt. And you could just bomb whoever is veers off the pipeline, but as long as you're on the pipe, you're safe. But look, I mean, getting back to your question about again, I feel like a lot of people, there is a lot of focus because the war is so bizarre, right? It really is a not war in so many ways, not just because you're not allowed to call it a war in Russia, but because it doesn't feel like a war because it's so bizarre and it's so unbelievable. Uh, and there's a lot of discussion on what really is going on behind the scenes, like what really triggered this. Is there collusion between the various state actors? Um, and look, all I can say is probably on some level, there are people who are, actively working, Russian government officials or military officials who are actively working against Russian interests, and probably the same is happening in Ukraine. Mikhail Delyagin, he's a State Duma deputy, recently came out and said that 11 trillion rubles had been basically stolen from the Russian Defense Ministry, over the course of so many years. And sorry. You had the thing with Shoigu, who, I'm sorry, was not promoted. He was basically given retirement on the National Security Council. But and you have all these arrests in the Russian Defense Ministry. Like, what was going on here, guys? I mean, is this just low level corruption? Was there something more sinister going on? I don't know. And probably a lot of the same kind of questions should be asked about Ukraine and its own military and how it's being used to, basically call a bunch of Slavs. Like it really does feel like that at this point. Like, what is actually being accomplished with this military conflict? Like what is actually being accomplished? I don't know. That's why I think it's important for people to be asking, like, what is really motivating this? I don't think it's morality, like who is more righteous and loves freedom the most. It's sort of like I'm sure we'll get into it later, but it's this whole when people start bubbling about BRICS, right? So, well, like, what does BRICS offer? What is BRICS offering the average dude that the G20 already isn't? They're gonna inject you, they're gonna tag you, they're gonna do all the same things. Like, what are we fighting over? Like, why is it that the oligarchs can get together and still make deals, and the peasants have to kill each other? Like, what's in it for us? I don't get it. So
I think you just painted the perfect picture there. And again, so many things here. The trillion rubles theft, Rurik posted it on his Substack, and I shared that. And again, I call this the multipolar mouthpieces, as you alluded to earlier. I want to ask about that as well. I call them now the multipolaristas, the cheerleaders who are like 1,000% just cheering on Xi Jinping and Putin, and they have this giant myopia, this giant blind spot where, oh, the social credit system doesn't exist. There's none of this authoritarian technocracy. Oh, and if there is, if you really press them on it and you show them like look, here it is, then they're like, oh, okay, it does exist, but it's a great thing. It right. helps the manage the society, like the people who don't throw trash on the street. That it helps keep good morals. And I'm just face palming, but I read someone sent me the news today that Croatia is introducing mandatory conscription next year, and that possibly even Croats abroad like myself. The question hasn't been answered that we might have to go be conscripted, and I'm like, there's no way in heck I'm gonna go die for Zelensky or some in the globalist NATO meat grinder. Not gonna. You come find me here somewhere in the jungles of Mexico. I'm not gonna do that. But just on the question of World War III, some people that I've had on posit that I'm on the fence. I think we could actually see an escalation and see an all-out war as we've seen in the past, because that's useful in so many ways to the global elite. Or there's some people posit that they're just going to keep us in this fear mode, like on the brink, like we're going to go to war, but we're not really. And they're just going to use that to it's like the Orwell thing where they just keep us tense and then panic mode as a way to control us. And then, they can bring in like war measures, as we saw with the health emergency, right? Like we're seeing now, we can get into this later, but I saw in us, they had lockdowns, right, with the health emergency. And then now in Alice Springs, Australia, a month ago, there was crime. So they're like, okay, snap curfew, snap lockdown. We have new special powers. So there's some crime. You're locked into your house. Then in the Olympics, you have the 15-minute city QR code city because there's security for Olympics. Then it's going to be so they're using all of these different vectors, and they could eventually say, martial law. Oh, there's a war situation. You got to be, you got to do QR codes again and lockdowns. And so, do you think there are interests in the West or East? It seems like more in the West, though, that could actually escalate to an actual war. It's more just fear porn.
It's so hard to say. What scares me is I always think that I'm cynical, and I think I'm too focused on the worst case scenario. But then something even worse actually ends up happening, right? Like I feel like I don't have the imagination to actually imagine how bad things can get at this point. Like truly. I mean, I don't know. It's just so when people say, maybe the war is going to wind down soon or something like that. Like that would be the logical thing to happen. Like logically, you would hope that there would be some kind of settlement. Of course, it's going to be any kind of settlement at this point is not going to last very long, and there's going to be more war eventually. I think that's just a given. But honestly, at this point, I really think that it's better than just sitting in trenches and sending suicide drones at each other for no reason whatsoever. I mean, at least let's take a break from it. But I think that also it's very, very likely that there could be an escalation. I don't understand this idea that a Trump victory in November would mean an end to the war and de-escalation. And I don't understand why people think that. In my humble opinion, even if Trump really truly does want peace in Ukraine, I don't see this guy as someone who is going to be standing firm, on like I'm going to give up everything just to achieve peace in Ukraine. This guy lives in a skyscraper with gold interior, and I mean, he just doesn't seem like a very principled guy to me. I'm sorry to say that. And also it's not even his fault. Like anyone in the White House is just they're basically just reading off an index card at this point, right? I don't Is he really going to be the one who decides the fate of Ukraine? I just find that to be very, very difficult to believe. So I really do think that escalation, what form that could take, I don't know. But I think that, you got F-16s arriving in Ukraine, allegedly. Things could get a lot worse. In just one mishap, right? Just one bad thing that happens, and things could really spiral. I mean, things are already out of control. Like, I hope people realize just how insane 2024 already is. That's another thing that really disturbs me about this conflict is every day, just the idea. I came to Russia 10 years ago, and the idea that the Ukrainian military using NATO weaponry could shell a city like Belgorod, or some village in that region, and a few Russian, 5 Russians are maimed or killed, and that's just like a bullet point in the daily headlines, and nothing is done about it. There's no, Russia doesn't cut off diplomatic relations with Washington, doesn't stop sending gas to Europe. Just another day in Russia now. It's very, very scary. It's very, very scary. And one of the saddest things about this is that apparently this is just the new normal. This has become completely normalized. Russians don't really talk about it. I don't think in the West they really understand how totally messed up it all is. And so what I'm trying to get at is, if this is normal for a lot of people, and unfortunately it is, why can't they just turn up the heat, right? Whether, quickly or slowly, if people are adjusted to this upside down garbage world, why not even make it more garbagey, right? Let's keep going. Let's see how far we can take this. I feel like that's sort of what they did with, the scary pandemic, right? The scary virus. They're like, let's see if they'll wear 3 masks. Let's just see if they'll do it. And like some people did, you know, and they're like, all right, that was pretty funny. Like, we'll shelf this. We'll come back to it in a few years, you know? And like, you know, I mean, it's funny, but it's also really sad because a lot of, I mean, these policies, like with the pandemic, destroyed public health around the world, in Russia too. I mean, I don't even want to get into it. And this not war is a very real war and has killed a lot of people and destroyed so many lives. And for what? Like it hasn't made people more secure. It hasn't prevented, you know, Ukraine from joining NATO. It hasn't stopped. It hasn't done any of the things that it was supposed to achieve, and it's probably made all of these things that you know need to be achieved much more difficult to achieve. I had a friend who said that you know Putin has achieved everything he set out to prevent, which I think is absolutely true. And I'm not, you know, is Putin really to blame at the end of the day? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe he was set up. Maybe the space lizards, you know, contacted him and told him to do something stupid. Who knows at this point? It's just madness, pure madness.
As you say, again, I can see things going either way. I could see escalation, or I could just see them playing this, you know, slow attrition game and keeping us always on edge. And, you know, either way, that would serve their interests. And, you know, as you mentioned with COVID, I was talking about this the other day. I mean, I feel like I still, in some ways, suffer from some sort of trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder. And COVID really has just eviscerated. It's just destroyed, and you know, it's made me more cynical. I don't want to have anything to do with any government anymore. It's this in some ways destroyed my interest in, you know, the arts. Like I don't watch movies anymore. It's all just propaganda, garbage. You know, I look at the Olympics, and it's just like I'm not interested in a lot of that garbage. I don't care anymore. And part of it is thanks to COVID. It's destroyed so many things, as you say. Health systems, you know, our beliefs in these institutions, in government, and in the healthcare, and everything. It destroyed businesses, livelihoods. It's kind of like it sucked the soul out of the planet. What they did, and the craziest thing is like they're planning to do it again. They're talking about it, but you know, you mentioned drones. Well, NATO first. Just any further thought on NATO, because I think this is also interesting. It was reported yesterday. I was looking at U.S. European Command report that you know, Colombia is a partner, global partner. Argentina just joined, and I was on TNT Radio talking about this not long ago, and they said that this year NATO's Special Operations Forces Command certified Colombian Special Forces during U.S. Southcom's fused response, in which they used the NATO Special Operations Planning process and tactics, techniques, and procedures. This certification highlights the interoperability and readiness of Colombian special forces to operate alongside NATO allies. And I'm calling it now the new, not the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but the New World Order Treaty Organization. And I did a short write-up on my Substack, people can check, where, you know, the general retired, I think Navy Commander Stavridis wrote a Bloomberg piece a couple months back saying, look, we should just have Thailand and Singapore and Philippines formally join NATO, and you know, Colombia and Argentina, all of South America, they should all just join NATO. They've even posited Mexico should join NATO, and there's articles talking about, look, we should rename NATO to New Alliance Treaty Organization. And my question is, like, is that to align with their new mission, or was that the original mission from the beginning, to become the global police force? And so I think, right, I feel like NATO, as you said, they've used this pretext now. Maybe they tricked Russia, or maybe Russia is in on it, but the outcome now is they're using this as leverage. NATO needs this enemy as leverage to expand, because if they don't have a Russia or China, they can't expand. And so I feel like they're using this now to basically expand and become this global military force. And I call it the one world army for the one world government. Just any further thought on NATO?
Yeah, well, I mean, NATO is like this arms extortion racket, right? And it's a dinosaur organization. I mean, it should be extinct. It existed to fight the Soviet Union, basically, which doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I think that's another reason why this whole conflict is so maddening. Because if you actually lived in Russia and understood, who could, the leaders of the Russian Federation and what they stand for, it's like there's no ideological difference between the Russian Federation and the West, none whatsoever. Like, yeah, okay, Russia's more socially conservative. There's a lot of NATO countries. Poland is quite a conservative country. There's a lot of places in the West that are actually quite socially conservative. And this is even openly admitted, actually. In fact, a lot of Russian like so-called turbo patriots get very angry because they're like, well, the reason why we can't defeat the West is because we have nothing to offer. Like, we have no alternative to offer the world. Like, we're the same consumerist, capitalist, SpongeBob SquarePants, Cheeto eating, Mercedes-Benz driving slobs, basically, and we don't have a alternative vision for the world anymore, like we did in the Soviet Union, which, well, there's a lot behind that, but allegedly the Soviet Union offered something quite different. But NATO, I agree with your assessment that in a way NATO doesn't want Russia to completely collapse, because then they'd lose a great money-making opportunity, right? Because for them, and this is another reason why I find it really interesting how, every day I'm sure, or I've heard stories about, how the Russian threat is always hyped up in the West, and I don't think it's because Russia actually, in fact, I think that the last few years have actually shown that the Russian military is not what it was presented as. I think that corruption ate away at a lot of its strength. I think that it had a lot of problems. But the reason why I think that the West, or the New York Times, will hype it up is because it's good for business, right? Because if you have this scary monster, Russia, more weapons sales. Raytheon's doing well. Lockheed Martin likes it, and maybe the goal is break apart Russia and then go after China and can complete the world conquest or something like that. But I mean, it's possible. That's not my first choice of what lies ahead in the future. I think that, actually our oligarchic overlords, they don't want us to get too riled up. They want to, in my opinion, they much prefer just a slow, slowly spiraling into the abyss, right? Where we all just become the same tagged, injected blobs. And, starting another world war, that creates a lot of variables that maybe you can't control, right? And in a way, I think that this war we're seeing now, which is very, very strange in the way that's being fought, with like people sitting in basements with their VR headsets driving drones into one another while they sit in trenches and nobody knows why they're even fighting anymore. And but this is the kind of, like, it's a very strange, like, controlled, like, virtual reality conflict, but it's still devastating. But it's not a world war yet, thankfully. And I think that they probably want to avoid it, in my opinion.
And one of the things that you mentioned, because you mentioned outcomes, and the way earlier that you described how you look at it is the same that I do. I find it a waste of time to be in the telegrams or whatever, the Twitters, looking at the daily troop movements, and it's like, right, you still don't even know what's going on. Like, the Ukrainian NATO telegrams tell you one thing, the Russians tell you the other.
Yeah,
and it's like, I can't even make sense anymore of what's going on. It's a waste of time, and I look for the big markers, right? That will. You focus on the big tectonic shifts that tell you then which way we're really headed, cui bono, who benefits, that sort of stuff. And one of the very real and scary outcomes you mentioned that I focus on a lot is the drone warfare. And I, just a New York Times article recently on BBC, and just want to read this excerpt here from BBC the other day. It says, Ukraine thrown into war's bleak future as drones open new front. And it says, the last images from drone cameras are usually of men panicking, their arms flailing, weapons firing before they are killed. The brigade's 37-year-old drone commander, who goes by the call sign Aeneas, says that without shelter in a building, there is little chance of survival for Russians and his men too. And it's like a scene from Black Mirror. There's an episode from Black Mirror where there are these drones that are programmed, that are automated and programmed to just kill all humans on sight. And then they wake up when they hear noise, and then they got like little knives and bullets and stuff like that, and the surviving humans are just running from these autonomous drone. Well, some of these are like robo dogs, and it's just this insane dystopian picture, and I can almost see all governments are working on these things. I've seen videos of the Chinese slapping guns on robo dogs and bombs, and the West is doing. They're all developing these things. Iran and India, and I kind of feel like this is Skynet becoming self-aware, tongue in cheek, and eventually these technologies, as we've seen with Iraq and the Vietnam War. I've had Doug Valentine on the podcast, and he posits that Operation Phoenix, this massacre of tens of thousands of Vietnamese run by the CIA or whatnot, that was brought back to America as the Department of Homeland Security. All of the Iraq tanks. You've got now police in America. They've got like tanks that have been brought back from Iraq, and so I feel like this stuff eventually could be used by all of the world's nations against us. So again, it's always the world's. I had Francis Boyle on last time, and he said basically it's all of our governments versus us. That's the real conflict. It's not East versus West, nation versus nation. I had market sniper Francis Hunt on the other day. He said the same thing. It's the oligarchies in all of our respective countries against us. Any thoughts on that? And the if we extrapolate, this drone prototyping that's going on.
Yeah, what it reminds me of is it reminds me of sort of in the years, when the Iraq War was starting to wind down, and even with Afghanistan, you had like the Pentagon donating surplus Humvees to local police departments, around the United States, and everyone with their, military grade weaponry that's from like Afghanistan or Iraq, and it's just the war's coming home, right? And now you have a police force. I think what is it like the NYPD is like the 5th largest army in the world or something like that, and they have like their own like anti-aircraft guns, I think. And so, I mean, I think what you're bringing up is really, it touches on what scares me on so many different levels, because we have all these new technologies that probably governments want to start toying with and seeing how they can best use it to maintain control and, keep the peasants down. But also it's like, what happens after, the Ukrainians and Russians stop fighting each other? Well, these technologies and weapons are going to be turned on the local populations. This should be obvious to anyone. And frankly speaking, I think that you can make a very strong case. I think this has been happening everywhere, and definitely in Russia, that since the so-called pandemic, you had a lot of new technologies that were being used to, stop the spread. And now they're with us probably forever, or, can be rolled out whenever we need it. And, this is further digitalization of every aspect of life, further control mechanisms, basically treating normal people as potential biohazards, or even, potential criminals, which was already the case to begin with. But, and this applies to facial surveillance, and payment methods that are supposed to be used, cashless or non-contact payment methods that are supposed to stop the spread of viruses, right? Which are now with us. And there's a huge list. And with this conflict now, unfortunately, it wouldn't surprise me at all. You actually have right now a major rehaul of how Russia does military conscription, and now it's going to be starting in autumn. You can receive a military summons through like the government's web portal, like where you pay your utility bills. It's like, oh, you've been summoned. And just receiving that message on the internet counts as an official summon. And if you don't respond to it, you're considered like, they can stop you from leaving the country. They can like freeze all of your accounts and things like that. It's really spooky. And so, yeah, there you go. I think you nailed it. Like the ultimate goal is just to keep us in line, make sure that the cattle, don't get too uppity. And anything that you think, if you're rooting for, like kill the stupid orcs, or like kill the Ukro Nazis, like you got to realize everything that's happening right now, they're just going to turn the guns on you eventually. They're coming for you.
You're going to have to drone proof your 15-minute outpost. You're going to have to think about that. Just
I'm
real.
digging a tunnel. I'm digging a tunnel.
I saw I saw photos of that on your Substack. Just real quick, you had, because these were both people that I've interviewed. I had Gonzalo Lira 2 years ago on the podcast. I was out in Croatia, and then he was on the podcast. I guess he passed at the hands of the Ukrainian regime, and then Texas Bentley was also on my podcast, and he was killed recently under suspicious circumstances. Any thoughts on those guys?
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, I think it's absolutely appalling. Like, if Lira was, I mean, from what I understand, he had already been detained previously by the SBU. He was released and then I guess arrested again while trying to leave the country. What did this guy do? He like made YouTube videos and wrote snarky tweets. Like, is that something that someone should be killed over? And look, I'll be honest. I disagreed with a lot of his analyses, and but who cares? Like, and what? Like, Are you not allowed to have an opinion anymore? And people say, well, but he lived in Ukraine, and they're at war, and he's a national security risk. Like, the guy, he was claiming that the Russian military was just a few days away from Kharkiv, like every day for a year. Like, was he really doing anything bad? I don't know. He was just saying stuff, and sometimes maybe people agree with him and maybe people didn't, but I don't know what he did wrong. And so yeah, that's disgusting. And it seemed to me, I mean, I didn't follow the aftermath really closely, but from what I understood, I mean, the U.S. government didn't care, and he was a U.S. passport holder, right? And Chilean, right? I believe, or
I think he had both citizenships. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. But anyway, like, obviously the Biden administration didn't care, which is disgusting. They're like funding the Ukrainian government, and I guess they can just like let some poor guy die in their prison. It's totally gross. And with Russell, it's really sad. And in fact, I just read an article in Russian media yesterday, a website called Blocknote, and they do some really good sort of investigative journalism. And their correspondent in Donbass wrote this report about the circumstances around Bentley's death, and sort of how it's like whatever happened to him, his wife hasn't received his body, right? Like, there's no body. They haven't returned. Nobody. There's no remains. And his poor wife is saying, like, listen, just let me let me give my husband a Christian burial. Let me just bury my husband who was killed under really suspicious circumstances. No one seems to be able to produce a body. And it's really messed up. And yeah, I mean, it was basically, it's really sad too, because I think that Bentley, again, I had some disagreements with him, but actually he was one of the few guys, I would say, who was popular in the media, who actually gave a fairly realistic assessment of the reality of how difficult the SMO has been, for people in Donetsk, and also in general, how not everything is going according to plan, if you're Team Z. And he gave 10 years of his life. He was in Donetsk, I think, since like 2014 or something. And he fought alongside the militias, and he was a man of conviction, and he was killed by service members of the Russian military. Like, I think that's an established fact. Nobody denies that. And it's sad that it does seem that the circumstances of his death, and also who is responsible, there's a lot of, it seems to be there's a real attempt to just sort of maybe, if not to cover it up, but just kind of keep it on the DL. I remember, actually, this was crazy. Sputnik, he was a correspondent for Sputnik, and Sputnik like published this obituary on their Telegram channel being like, Russell Bentley died tragically in Donetsk. Like, he didn't die tragically. He was killed. Like, he was murdered. It's just like, come on, guys. Like, if I get it, like, you're Team Z, you don't want to give like the enemy any, free points. Just be honest and hold your own side accountable. And that way you differentiate yourself from the so-called, Ukro Nazis or whatever. I just don't get it. I just don't get it,
I see some similarities, and again, this is a universal thing when it comes to the oligarchies that rule us, whichever state. And I see examples like Pat Tillman. When you have these figures that draw a lot of attention, that are like these popular freedom fighters, and you had Pat Tillman, who's going to be this NFL superstar that went off to fight the war in Afghanistan after 9/11, the war on terror, and people look up to these manly men like Pat Tillman fighting conviction and really believe, standing for what they believe in, and he dies under these mysterious friendly fire circumstance in Afghanistan. In my opinion, he was starting to question the war, and so imagine if Pat Tillman comes out and like, yeah, this is all a sham, and how's the military industrial complex going to deal with that? And so they kind of shut him up. In my opinion, I think they took him out intentionally. They took out Pat Tillman to shut him up, and then my very first podcast, on the precursor to Geopolitics and Empire, the channel Dissident Thinker, it's up. That was in 2012. I interviewed Corporal Jesse Thornton. He was brought on stage during the Ron Paul rallies. My very first, sort of YouTube podcast, and he was privately messaging in Facebook to his friends and family. He wasn't posting publicly, but he was questioning 9/11 through private messages on Facebook. He got the American secret police. Like, he got visited by the local secret police, and they just renditioned him. They threw him in a car. And I think again, that same idea, that fear was, he's a veteran, and citizens listen to veterans. Right. And if the veteran starts talking about false flag terror and the sham of the war, people are going to start waking up quicker. And luckily, another one of my podcast guests who I have great respect for, John Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute, who he was on 2 years ago, but a decade ago, John Whitehead got Corporal Thorson out, and they were going to put him like in a psych ward or something. Absolutely insane. So I feel like that's maybe what happened with Bentley, where he was, and when he was on with me, I openly said I'm not a communist. He's a commie, and I said, but he wore his heart on his sleeve. I think Bentley. And he was also questioning. He's like, multipolarity is not a bad idea, but he was also questioning things. He was being honest in that respect, and he was also questioning, like you and I are, like what's going on with the Russian military. And so, that for me, that's the scenario that makes the most sense. And real quick, I want to ask you about the Scott Ritter passport thing. You talked about that. Ritter's been on my podcast. Where he was going to go to the SPIF, I think, the St. Petersburg forum, and they took his passport apparently. And just any thought on what's interesting there, or the greater meaning?
Well, look, I mean, I wrote about it, and of course I immediately got brigaded by, Scott Ritter fanboys, which, fine, whatever, fair play. But the point I was trying to make by covering this is that Ritter's trip, so basically what Ritter had done is that he had partnered with this guy, Alexander Ziganov, I believe his name is. I mean, it's been so long, I don't remember it now. But he contacted Ritter. He's a businessman. He works for some development agency, and oh god, I can't even. Is it like Novosibirsk or something like that? Anyway, he's some sort of Russian official who works in business development in one of the regions. Contacts Ritter. This was more than a year ago. Says, hey, I really like your stuff. Let's team up. You should come to Russia. I can show you around. I can show you what Russia's really like. Ritter agrees. They get Ritter's, through this gentleman, they translate Ritter's book into Russian. Ritter does this big book tour. He comes back again to Russia, I believe, at some point. And then this third trip was supposed to be this summer long. It's going to start with the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And then after that, they were going to travel around Russia and make this documentary. And, Ritter's relationship, with this gentleman, Alexander, was supposed to serve as this, example. Like, look, I'm a Russian, or he's a Russian, I'm an American. We're great friends. This is the real Russia. There's no reason for Washington and Moscow to quarrel, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, it sounds great. I mean, on a basic level, I definitely support this kind of activism. I'm down with it. But what ended up happening is that a few hours before Ritter's flight, Ziganov, Alexander, he gets arrested by the FSB, allegedly on these very, very bizarre like corruption charges. And so what that means is that Ritter's entire travel itinerary just went up in smoke. Like he was partnering, like Ritter talked about this. Like I'm with this guy, Alexander Sasha, and we're going to travel around Russia together and make this documentary. And like, that's my plan. And they had like commemorative coins with him, his co-host, and, this Russian gentleman. And he was arrested by the FSB a few hours before Ritter was going to fly to Moscow. So I guess the point I was trying to make was like, yeah, it's really messed up that Ritter had his passport seized before getting on that flight. That's horrible. I don't condone it at all. I think it's disgusting. It's terrifying because I always have that fear, right? You're like about to get on a plane and some spook comes up and jumps you. I don't. That's horrible. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is the trip had already gone up in smoke before Ritter even got on that plane, and nobody wants to talk about it. Like, yeah, the State Department screwed Ritter over. I agree. I think it was cowardly. It was horrible, despicable. Use whatever adjective you want. But like when we're talking about, trying to bring peace to the world and like how, trying to understand the actual dynamics going on here between the United States government and the Russian government, why is it that everyone is focused on, this despicable act the State Department did when Ritter's entire trip had been destroyed by the Russian government before he even got into the airport, right? And what also really bothered me was that Ritter was totally silent about it. Like he didn't mention it really. He didn't talk in any meaningful way about this arrest of his alleged, who he described as a close friend who was going to spend the entire summer with in Russia. And it was only after I wrote this article, just saying, hey, like Ritter's sponsor, the guy who got him a visa to come to Russia, had been arrested by the FSB. Everyone who knows him says it was a total setup. Like it's really messed up. Why in the independent media is nobody talking about this and like asking questions like what is really going on here? Like why would the FSB arrest Ritter's partner? I don't have an answer to that, by the way. I mean, it could be just for local, political squabbles, and maybe there's like a larger agenda here. Who knows? But we should be at least asking the basic questions. And nobody was asking it. And then after I wrote this article, Ritter did do a podcast appearance, although I don't know if he made any statement since then, acknowledging that this guy had been arrested, condemning it, saying that he didn't think he had done anything wrong. Anyway, the whole scenario is very strange to me. And again, I just want to reiterate, I think that Scott Ritter should be able to travel freely. You know me, I'm 100% against all cattle tags. I don't think passports should even exist. So Ritter should be able to go wherever he wants, say whatever he wants. That's cool. But like, if you want to talk about what screwed up Scott Ritter's trip, the State Department did, and so did the FSB, so did the Russian government. And it's just weird to me that nobody wants to like admit that. I don't know.
Yeah, again, my sponsor, the Expat Money Summit, talking about internationalization. That's why I've got 3 passports. So if the U.S. did took away my U.S. passport on that flight, and they're thinking, okay, you're not going anywhere. We took your flight. You can't stop me. I'm going to continue because this is the Croatian property, government, and Mexican government property, so I can continue on my journey. And thanks to having my Croatian passport, I was able to escape Kazakhstan back to Mexico during the health emergency because they were not letting in non-Europeans pass through Europe, and so this let me and my family get out of Dodge. And so again, that's important if you can get extra residencies or passports. And as you say, often we don't know who we're dealing with. Right. I've had a few instances. Sometimes I meet with my listeners if they're passing through town or I'm passing through town, and I'm paranoid. Like, I don't know who you are. You say you're my listener, whatever. You could be some secret agent, and I've had strange, encounters with people in Kazakhstan, some American guy who, it was a really strange thing. This guy worked for an international organization in Kazakhstan. I thought I'd interview him in person, but he left, like he finished his thing and he went back in the US. This is the weirdest thing. And he told me he with his own money, he bought the flight and flew back to Kazakhstan, like just for me to interview him. And it just like, that doesn't make any sense. And then, he bought us all dinner, and he worked for like the World Bank or something, maybe Western intelligence. And I'm like, none of this makes any sense. And so I was just red flags right there. And so I've had Kazakh intelligence, inquiring about me. And so no one knows who I'm working for. I'm a triple, quadruple agent. No, I'm just a one man skeleton crew upper, average dude, just talking to people online. And just what we referenced earlier, the multipolar mouthpieces. Get your thought on that. The McGregors. I've had on McGregor. I met him. Interesting guy. I respect a lot of people, but I cannot help but not notice this strange thing online. Jackson Hinkle. He's like some jock that just blew up out of nowhere. I think he was artificially blown up. Now he founded the American Communist Party, which is the most insane thing. And then you've got the McGregors, the multipolar mouthpieces. It's like this clique of the Larry Johnsons, the Scott Ritters, the Hinkles, and all these the BRICS multipolar people. I was invited to be on a Twitter space with one of these multipolaristas, and it was the strangest thing where I was talking, and then as soon as I criticized BRICS or multipolarity, all of a sudden the host couldn't hear me. Like I was talking, everyone else could hear me, and then he starts talking over me, and I'm like I had to stop because he's talking over me, and he's like, "Oh, I can't hear you," but everyone else hears me. It's like, this is funny because as soon as I started criticizing, shut him up, shut him down, and I feel like some of these multipolar mouthpieces are on some payroll, right, and that their accounts are artificially boosted. Like it's really exaggerated. You see some of their followings on Telegram and Twitter and YouTube, and they don't get censored. Meanwhile, little old me is getting censored nonstop, strikes on YouTube, and they almost have free reign. And I've even had Geopolitics Live, the channel that's linked to Sputnik. They keep incessantly in my Telegram channel saying, looking for the admin, wanting to make a deal to cross post where they'll post me, Geopolitics and Empire, and Geopolitics Live, and I will promote Geopolitics Live on Geopolitics and Empire. And it's like, I don't want to have anything to do with that because I want to be like Yuri Roshka, a non-aligned dissident. So I don't want to be involved with anyone. And so your sort of thought on these, and a lot of the predictions haven't been come true, as you say, of some of these people. And so your thoughts on some of these multipolar mouthpieces. Did this sort of, am I crazy here, or is there some sort of pattern that I've laid out?
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, the McGregors, Ritter, there's a whole list of it. A lot of what these guys say, I totally agree with. Like, I also am not a fan of NATO. I also don't like, Israel vaporizing Gaza. Go down the list. Like, the fact that I don't consider BRICS to be our salvation doesn't mean that I have anything nice to say about the current state of affairs. It just means that I understand, like, as far as I know, I don't see BRICS actually advocating for anything fundamentally different, on a personal level. Like what are we pretending that BRICS is going to spread, freedom and prosperity for the average Joe or Ivan or, wherever you live in the world?
Juan.
I mean, I would love to have, I would love to actually just have an open, sincere conversation with some of these guys and just say, listen, pitch me, why should I care? Why should anyone care about BRICS? Why? Explain to me. I wrote a post maybe a year ago. This was when, I guess it was maybe this was back in November, I think, when BRICS met and they put out this statement, about all the things they want to do. And there was all the UN buzzword like sustainable development and digitalization. And, we need pandemic preparedness and, copy pasted from any of the creepy globalist organizations. And then, a week later, the G20 meets and it's literally the same document, just a few words mixed around. And you could just go and see what they say themselves and then ask yourself, why should I care? What possible, if they're telling you directly to your face, yes, we are for digital IDs. Yes, we are for, rapidly developing vaccines to fight pandemics. Why would you trust these people over any other group of weirdos? Why? At least make the case, explain it to me. Right. And, but sort of getting back to the multipolaristas, as you call them, I mean, it's frustrating because on one level, yeah, I agree with them. And then, whenever, occasionally I have been publicly critical of some of these gentlemen, I get a lot of pushback because like, oh, you're attacking your own team. Like, stop like they're on our side. They're fighting the good fight. They're fighting NATO, and you're harming this great. It's like, guys, I just don't want the peasants to vaporize each other. And I don't understand what's going on here. And I don't see, one of the weird things about these guys too is like I don't really see them. A lot of them sort of style themselves as peace activists, but you like go to their YouTube channels or whatever, their Telegram, and it's all about like Russia's about to like just totally destroy NATO and like bring Washington to its knees through, we're gonna like carpet bomb Joe Biden's face 1,000 times. It's like every day. It's like this over the top mush, like this violent, like petty, ridiculous word salad. And it's not even that their predictions are wrong. Their predictions are fantasy. Like I get someone being like, listen, I think that there's going to be some negotiations and referenda will be held in the remaining parts of Donbass and blah, blah, blah. Like that's just putting out a potential scenario. These guys say regularly, oh man, next is Kharkiv, next is Odessa, Kiev is like just around the corner. Like this is not a prediction. This is fantasy. This is making statements based on absolutely nothing. Like there's no basis in reality, like objective, observable reality when you're saying these things. And so when they do it, it makes me worried, and I don't know whether they're doing it just because they want, like, I guess that people like hearing this kind of stuff. It's sort of like group therapy, I guess, for some segment of the news watcher. But part of me worries that there might be a more sinister agenda behind all this. And I don't know which way it goes. I've heard all sorts of theories about what's really motivating this kind of, punditry or analysis. I don't know, but I find it to be very, very annoying and frustrating, and it makes it very difficult just to have a sane conversation about realistic outcomes and talking about, how do we actually work towards making things better instead of, hopping into bed with BRICS, which is offering people the exact same thing that we have right now, or maybe in some ways an accelerated and more disgusting form of what we have right now. And, how do we break free of this, daily screaming YouTube headline, independent news stuff where it's every day Kharkiv is about to fall. Every day Odessa, we're going to take Odessa. Every day, like, whatever. It sucks. I don't like it. I'm sick of it.
Yeah, well, again, the thing that unnerves me is, as you say, I've done these thought exercises in my mind regarding these topics, and I just can't unnotice that trend where a lot of these figures, it's like they're reading from a script. They're saying the same. They're boosted. They're saying the same thing. A lot of these fantasies that don't come true, and some of the things they do say. I'm with you. I'm not a fan of NATO, or the Empire, or a lot of these things. But then they make these. If we check their track record of the past few years, when it comes to the war aspect, like it hasn't come true. What they've said that Russia's going to, in a week, take this or that, and no. And so then you have to start questioning what's the real game here, what's the real motivation. And again, on BRICS, I've talked about this with Yuri Roshka and others. Putin the other week said that BRICS should form a parliament. And I always point out that the idea of BRICS was coined by a World Economic Forum young global leader, this Indian lady, together with Goldman Sachs' Jim O'Neill. So they coined it. And as you say, it's all full-on globalist. And I view multipolarity as a quicker path towards the tyrannical world government, because they're onboarding quickly now all of these other. So we've basically had a divide where you've had like the G7 totalitarian global West and a certain portion of the world's planet that, for whatever reason, could not get on board for economic reasons, or they're resisting this G7 global system. And it's almost now like, okay, we're going to try the other way, where we're going to sell them this BRICS thing. Is like Coke and Pepsi. Okay, we're going to do the other route now. And they've created this BRICS infrastructure, and they're plugging in all of these global South countries, and everyone's joining now. And basically, but as you said, they're more advanced with the algorithm ghetto, and it's almost like the Bretton Woods system has died. And I could see, and Putin's now talking about BRICS parliament. So it's like almost BRICS could become the new world government, the new UN, and it's going to have an even more advanced digital technocracy. And then I see it as a quicker path towards world federation or world government. And then your further thoughts on the cattle tag agenda, the digitalization. I mean, you talk about it in Russia, and again, how can you not? How can these people ignore these things? The cattle tagging in Russia. You're talking about now you can pay with a smile on your face. That the multipolar world will be the most convenient world in world history. They're pushing biometrics in Russia, and so in Mexico here 2 weeks ago, UNESCO said Mexico should implement a single unified digital identity. And so it's yesterday, the EU is now rolling out the EU vaccine passport. They're prototyping it in 5 countries. And so it's happening in EU, it's happening in Mexico and America and Canada and Brazil, and Croatia and Kazakhstan and Russia and China. Yet people sort of like, when it happens in a country, like for the multipolaristas, they ignore it. Okay, it's not happening in Russia and China, or if it is, it's a great thing. So any further thoughts on this whole digital agenda? I kind of feel, I'm cynical. I feel like it's just advancing. I don't see it stopping, and pretty soon we're all going to be screwed.
Yeah, look, I don't think if you want to just look at it, if we were going to try to make comparisons here, I mean, Russia and I'm sure China even more so. I mean, I haven't actually been there, but from what I've read, they are really pushing hard for this digitalization stuff. They're really into the biometric stuff. They want, this pay with a smile technology, which is developed by Sberbank, which is headed by Hermann Greff, who was a former member of Board of Trustees of the World Economic Forum, who has been involved in basically every possible bizarre Schwabian nightmare scenario. This guy has played a part in implementing it or trying to in Russia, like everything from sustainable development or whatever to climate change to Sputnik V, the development of Sputnik V, to facial recognition, to education using AI algorithms instead of teachers. Everything this guy is involved in it, and Spare, obviously. And the pay with their face thing, it's really creepy. Like, I live in a tiny little village, and the closest town to me is about 30 kilometers away. And in this little town, which is maybe 2,000 people, like, you have the local butcher has their pay with a smile kiosk. You go to the pharmacy, pay with the smile kiosk. And, of course, probably the vast majority of people are not using this right now. But give it 5 years, give it 6 years, and we'll see, how many people are paying with the face, right? And I guess the big update from Russia when it comes to sort of the digital gulag or whatever you want to call it is Russia is marching forward with the CBDC, their version of it, the digital ruble. And Putin recently came out and said he wants to see, they did about a year of this really small scale test run, like really small, which is sort of surprising. But even after this small scale test over about 12 months, Putin came out recently and said, yeah, we're shooting for the full scale implementation of the digital ruble. We're going to ramp up our, testing. This is, a convenient and effective technology. We love it. I mean, imagine if Joe Biden said something like that. And again, that doesn't justify anything. Like, if Joe Biden did say it, of course, Joe Biden's still a scumbag. But it's like, where's the outrage, guys? Like, especially if you're promoting BRICS as some sort of unique alternative, offering a light at the end of the tunnel, right? You have the West that's doing all this horrible, misusing technology to curb stomp the average Joe. And then you're looking to BRICS to bring humanity and freedom back to the globe. And they're like doing it faster than they are in the West. Like, what's the argument here? That's all I want to know. Like, what is the argument? Like, what are people actually advocating for? If you're against CBDCs, BRICS is not an alternative. BRICS is like the CBDC bloc. China is even, I think, even further ahead than Russia is. India, I think, has a very, very sophisticated, although apparently not doesn't work very well. It has like this whole digital ID system that they use, I
Adar.
believe.
I was just going to say the I
Right.
in BRICS, the Adar system. I was reading the other day to get the gas connection to your home in India or
Right.
one part of India. You gotta give up your eyeball. You want gas for cooking and heating? Give me your
Yes.
eyeball. You had to submit your biometrics to get your gas connected. And I think, as you said, over the next 5, 6 years or whatever, we're going to see this happening in all countries where they're going to be slowly cutting their off ramps, whether it's the ability to use cash or to get one service, the analog routes, they're going to cut off those off ramps. So your only option is going to be your eyeball or your palm scan or your facial scan. And for me, again, that's very reminiscent of the book of Revelation, Mark of the Beast. In many ways, I think the mark of the beast has been with us for a long time. It's this, idea of submitting to the satanic totalitarian governments over the years, right? Like if you don't bow down, we're going to burn you at the stake or kill you or whatever. But now it's like reaching its pinnacle where I think they're cutting cash, and we're seeing this. You pay with either your face now in many places or your palm. Like those are the two options, kind of like Revelation, where your right hand or your forehead, and it's like if you go to do any public or private service, I've been saying this a lot, you're either going to scan with your palm, right, your right hand, or you're going to scan pay with your face, but only if your social credit is in good standing. So if you're a dissident in any way where you don't align with the global SDGs or whatever, you're going to go buy your meat or your bread, pay with your face, and it's like, sorry, access denied. You posted this yesterday or something. I think that's where we're headed. And any thoughts on that and how, I guess, basically the solution is doing what you're doing out there in your outpost?
Well, okay, yeah, I agree. I think that I don't agree with this idea that, and this comes across, in our daily, when we're scrolling through our news feeds. I think that there's this tendency where people really want to believe that like there's just gonna be a day when everything collapses, or they finally, the iron boot comes out and everybody gets stomped. I don't think that's how it's gonna work. It's a slow burn. It's a process that's gonna take 1 or 2 generations. And I mean, think about. I'll give you an example just in Russia. In some ways, a biometric ID doesn't actually sound. I mean, from a convenience standpoint, it doesn't sound that bad because in Russia they're obsessed with all sorts of. You have to get all sorts of paperwork and stamped things, and you have multiple different forms. You have like a domestic passport and other forms of ID that you might need to just solve some basic problem, with the local government. But what if it could all be stored on your face and you don't need to bring your ID to and you don't even have to leave your house. You can do it all through Gososlugi, which is the government, services portal. And so, yes, right now, maybe for many Russians, this is taboo and they understand the dangers that would come with this convenience, right? Because it allows them to shut out anyone they want for any reason from participating in, society. But who says that in 10 years, a young Russian doesn't would think that it's absolutely insane that you'd have to bring a piece of paper to an office when you could just log onto your little tablet and stare at it and it scans your face and now you can decide, which kindergarten you're going to attend or whatever, right? It's like this stuff gets implemented just through habit and convenience. And I don't think that it's going to be forced down people's throats. Like it was obviously in a certain extent with COVID, but a lot of people did it voluntarily, and a lot of the things that was done for COVID just ended up staying anyway, right after the pandemic. And so, if there is a crisis, we have to assume that even after the crisis is solved, after we flatten the curve, we keep the facial surveillance cameras, we keep all the new fun gadgets that our governments have developed to keep us in check. So that's sort of how I see the next few years playing out. I don't foresee like a single moment in time where it's like, well, they just passed this law and now it's all over and they're going to ban cash. I think that cash will be phased out almost organically, right? Sort of like how a lot of people never thought that a credit card or a debit card would work, and yet they're ubiquitous now. People don't even consider using a debit card any kind of, they don't see it as some sort of form of evil technocracy or digital control. But in a way, it is, because a bank could just block your card at any time they wanted to, and they could just give some stupid excuse. So, I mean, cash is really the only thing you can rely on, but a lot of people are almost all with their cards now, and that's totally normal. It wasn't that way, when they were first introduced. It took some time. So anyway, that's how I see all that nasty digital stuff coming to a neighborhood near you. As for the solution, look, I mean, I'm not one of these guys who pretends to have any solutions. I'm just doing what feels good. I just can't, to be honest, I just can't have a normal job anymore. Like, first of all, I don't think anyone will hire me, but also I like the idea of having to sit at a desk and like pretend to be productive is so hateful to me. I think I'd rather just live in a ditch, and just I don't know. I just can't wrap my head around going back to the office or trying to live a kind of, respectable middle class city dwelling life. So I don't know if what I'm doing makes sense. It probably doesn't. It might end in total disaster. Who knows? But I just gotta do what I gotta do, right? And it's been a lot of fun. It's been very educational. It's been very eye opening, and in many ways, it's not easy. Sometimes it's really not fun, but it really does make you appreciate just the little things in life, like a clean glass of water, and just being physically clean is also not so easy if you don't have running water. And you just have to sort of you got to like reprogram your mind to think about what does success look for me at the end of the day, right? Is it like what is a successful day? And my successful day now is like going to the well and getting 15 liters of water, and then like shoveling manure and like getting some eggs and milk and hanging out with, outside, and, going to Banya. And it's just a different life, And I don't know. It's cool, I guess.
I'm right with you. I taught internationally, high school, university over a decade. I could still go back and teach. I was offered a gig in South Korea a couple of months back, and I'm just done with traveling. Like you said, the paperwork and worrying about if I'm going to be locked down again in South Korea and I can't travel anymore without being injected. And I'm like, no, I'm all right. And I did the TNT radio, and now it's just fun and then I'm just like you now. Like I'm making less money, but I'm just my own man now. And again, if people want to if people want me to keep outputting Geopolitics and Empire, it's like $5 a coffee a month, $5 a month. Really not much to keep this going. If I get enough people, I can keep going in perpetuity until I get drone bombed or renditioned or ice picked like Trotsky. they can just hire a narco to whack me. Oh, it was just sorry, just a robbery gone bad. But I'm giving them ideas. They already know all this stuff. It's really really simple to figure out. But one of my last questions is, as I call them now, the Pentagon activnie miery, active measures. It's interesting. Are you a Russian agent, Riley? It's funny because
Right.
I think in all media, people have tried to classify you as as a U.S. agent, as they have Rurik Skywalker or Nikola Mikovic, the Serbian analyst who used to write for me, who's been on the podcast. He's just cynical. Like he's kind of like us. He doesn't believe in any state. They're all corrupt oligarchies, and he's been classified as a U.S. pro NATO agent. And so then this guy last week. So what happened to me last year was some anonymous Twitter account, a couple of guys started pointing out my interviews with people like Matthew Arid and Texas Bentley and all these different people, and then trying to link me, raw egg nationalist, right, and others. And so last year they tried to make me out to be this neo-fascist, white supremacist, anti-Semite Nazi. But it's like, and I fought right back. And I'm like, look, some of my listeners call me Geopolitics and Empire because I'm not obsessed with the Jewish question. So like the proof is right there that I'm not. And I became a Mexican and married a brown person. So I de facto, I have the evidence to prove I cannot be a neo-Nazi white supremacist. So it's like they dropped it. And so last week, it's like they've come back to they want to label you the Pentagon active measures,
Right.
the DHS NATO. It's like, okay, we couldn't get him with the anti-Semite. Let's go back to the drawing board, Russian agent. And this guy, Eyes of the Republic, did this big write-up of me linking me. I interviewed Bentley and Daniel McAdams, Ron Paul people, calling me a crypto communist Russian agent, and
Interesting.
it's just, and then I saw them going after Nikola Mikovic, and it's just like what planet are you guys on? He's known as a U.S. agent. Now you're calling him a Russian agent? Like,
Right.
none of this makes sense. But this is interesting because the same week, last week, NewsGuard, which we all know was created by NSA Pentagon as arbiter of truth, they went after this Jonathan Turley, who wrote about this. I was sitting at the table with him last year at the Ron Paul Institute conference. And, he's all over the place. He's a little libertarian. He's a registered Democrat. He's a bit conservative. So they can't get you. And he said NewsGuard was coming after him, and they wanted him to self-identify as either a conservative or a libertarian, because once they classify you with that, then they can classify you as a Russian agent, as a domestic terrorist extremist. And it's kind of like the same thing what this guy was doing to me last week, because he can't, I'm talking to everybody. He can't figure me out. And he cherry picks the people that I've talked to. Jeff J. Brown, I think, who's out in China, but then he completely ignores all of the American military folks that I've interviewed, who are hardcore anti-communists. And he's like, I'm like, look, I interviewed these people. I'm not a communist. And he's like, no, I'm not ignoring you. You're a Russian agent. Like, by hook or by crook, he's got to make me out to be this. And so, your sort of thoughts on these disinformation operations by DHS NATO, because I think we could be in serious trouble later on, because they can actually fine us, eventually jail us as extremists. And that leads me to my question with Yuri Roshka. I've interviewed him. I've chatted with him. You wrote about him. In a couple days' time, he might be sentenced to 4 years or more in jail. And he's just he's an anti-Soviet, anti-communist dissident, anti-globalist dissident. And it seems like he's got a lot of following, and Moldova, his government has been taken over by the EU Western globalist empire, and it's like they want to shut him up now. So, any thoughts on the active measures, the globalist Pentagon active measures against some of us?
Yeah, I think that probably they're going after you because you refuse to take a side, right? You're not playing the game, right? You got to play the game. You got to take a side. You got to support the false dichotomy, right? And yeah, of course, it's totally unacceptable, right? I mean, I think that honestly, they like, for example, someone like I don't know, you have people like I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, like someone like Anne Applebaum, right, who writes for the Washington Post. I think I haven't read her in many years. Just this neocon freak, space lizard lady. And she has her own little narrative, and then you have people, in the media who just are basically an inverse of her, who are just saying, the Russian military is going to wipe NATO off the map, and blah 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 blah. And Moscow is the savior of freedom and democracy around the world. And as long as you're playing this little game, I think that people are generally actually okay with it. But then, you're not allowed to inconvenience the narrative, and the narrative requires both sides in order to work, right? And okay, like when they label people Russian agents, I mean, it's just so stupid. It's just really very, very silly. What can even be added to something like that? It's I mean, I don't know, like there are people who even, work for Russian state media who I wouldn't consider a Russian agent. A lot of people, have relationships with various news outlets that receive government funding from around the world. And I wouldn't consider them necessarily, an agent of a government. They're just, for a lot of people, it's a job or just an opportunity to speak their mind using a certain platform. I mean, it just shows, it illustrates how stupid everything is. Just I don't know how else to put it. It's really sad. It's really no good. And turning to Roska's case, which is definitely nothing to laugh about. It's really disturbing. And here's a guy, he was a militant anti-communist during the Soviet Union, and then became very suspicious of the collective West and the European Union, and later also became very, very suspicious of Moscow and its own involvement in basically the globalist project, which is just as Yuri has shown so many times in his own writing, it's just an objective truth that Russia and China are promoting the same globalist agenda that's, stamped by the UN and the G20 and the WHO and, the IMF and the WTO. They're all about it. And it's sad to see, and the specifics of his case. I mean, I don't know like the nitty gritty detail, but everything I read about it, I took some time and I read some local media reports in Romanian. I mean, using machine translations, but the case sounds absurd. It's like he was accused of like using his position, a government position, to promise a certain outcome in some sort of legal dispute. And this happened in like 2009, and it was an allegation from a single guy. And then the government came, brought the charges against him like 10 years later, and then they shelved it, and then they brought it back for some reason. And there was all these weird anomalies and breaches of decorum within the court case itself, or the court proceedings. And it just sounds hellish. And I really feel bad for Yuri, because I haven't actually met him in person, but all the interactions I've had with this guy he's a much needed voice in a sea of bullshit. And so it's really sad to see him being targeted like this. And I really do hope that he won't have to spend the next 4 years in jail, because that would be really heartbreaking. So,
yeah, he messaged me the other day saying he's looking at 4 years, but I think he's the kind of person that could, he could be one of those Solzhenitsyn types. And what can you do? What's going to happen is going to happen to all of us. As Nick Cave would say, what will be, will be. We covered the gamut, the waterfront here. Any final thoughts? I was going to ask you, would you ever move back to the West? We had the Olympics, the total clown show, the whole Trump thing where he splashed ketchup on his face. I'm being silly here. I know some. I'm kind of. I don't.
Oh man, that's controversial.
I just triggered a bunch of people. I kind of like
triggered.
I don't buy almost virtually anything anymore, because they have now the capacity, whether it's deep fake or CGI or Hollywood methods. It's all fake. And so any final thought for us, Tavarish Waggaman?
I mean, to answer your question, I mean, I guess that the one thing that is not fun about living abroad is that you're away from, a lot of family. And if I did move back to the West, it would be for, to be closer to my mom, something as simple as that. But it's not a bad reason to go back, in my opinion. Maybe it wouldn't be a permanent move, but I could see it's a possibility, possibly, maybe, in certain circumstances. But aside from that, final thoughts, I don't know. It would be great if, people can start using the internet to ask more questions and stop regurgitating talking points from various governments who are trying to pollute your mind with mindless, retarded word salad that doesn't benefit you in any meaningful way. And also, how are we going to stop this insane war in Ukraine? And where's the off ramp here, guys? Is anyone going to ask this question? Like, where's the off ramp? I don't think it's going to end with Kiev being conquered or Moscow going up in flames. I think it's going to be way more depressing than that. So I don't know. It just doesn't look that great just looking at it right now. But what can I say? I've got my eggs, I've got my milk, I've got my manure, and I'm just trying to survive out here. And anyone listening is welcome to come hang out. That's how I'll end. Come hang out with me in the village.
It's like Patrick McGoohan, the prisoner in the village. And where's your best point of contact? I think is it just your Substack or Telegram or what?
Yeah, I mean, I have a Telegram channel. I don't really use it that much, but just through Substack, edwardslavsquat.substack.com, and all my contact information is there. So subscribe. You should subscribe to Geopolitics and Empire and Edward Slavsquat. It's a good package. It's like a party, information party.
It'll get you on a list, and yeah, if you're not subscribed,
Yes.
if you're not subscribed to Riley's Substack, почему нет? So Riley, stay safe, stay sane, take it easy on the vodka, and again, thanks for being on Geopolitics Empire.
Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.